Clearwater, Florida, a 35-year-old woman disappeared one summer night.
This case was so challenging, it looked like the offender had intentionally removed evidence from the victim.
Investigators found themselves in a race against time to figure out what had happened and who was responsible.
It was apparent that the crime involved a certain degree of planning. Based on our experience, we believed he may try to do this again.
Clearwater, Florida, where beaches and waterways define the landscape. Most people come here to find the sand and the sun. But one summer morning, a local man discovered something else. The body of a woman in some tall weeds near a vacant lot. Detective Wilton Lee arrived at the scene.
We received a call from a homeless person stating that he discovered a body on this lot. The body was discovered in this area over here.
There were few clues at the scene to help identify the victim.
The body was completely declothed. There was no evidence of jewelry, rings, or anything.
Sergeant Lee knew immediately what he was dealing with.
Upon examining the body here on scene, there were signs of a struggle and violence. It was clear to us at this time that this was a homicide, but what we didn't know is how the body got here.
It appeared the perpetrator had simply vanished. Ultimately, fingerprints identified the victim as LaDonna Stella.
She was about 35 years of age. She was married at one time, and she worked in one of the local restaurants.
LaDonna lived within 1 mile of where her body was found. But how did she end up in an abandoned lot? Sergeant Lee turned to the medical examiner's report for answers.
We learned from the medical examiner that the victim died from strangulation. She was bound by wrist and ankle. We couldn't tell how she got there. She could have been killed at one location and then dropped off there, but at this time we're not sure.
Investigators had no clue where she was killed or why. What they learned about the victim's last known movements didn't help.
We retraced her steps the night that she was killed. We made contact with her girlfriend and learned that she was last seen getting into a pickup truck. We followed up on those leads, but ran into a dead end.
But before long, another body was discovered, and the crime scene was eerily familiar. This time, the victim was 42-year-old Wendy Evans. She was found outside the city of Clearwater in Pinellas County, 20 miles away from where the first body was found. Detective Tom Klein was assigned to the case.
The body of the victim was actually found off the side of this road here. She was off in this wooded area, this overgrown brush area. She was found by a truck driver that was passing by, looked over to the side here and saw her lying face down in the brush here. And he called the sheriff's office. We get out here, we find the body of the victim. She's face down, she's completely nude, no personal items around, no jewelry on her. We had no idea who she was.
This was clearly no accident. Police knew it was a homicide.
At one point, we turned her over. We found that she had injuries to her face as if she had been in a struggle and had been beaten.
In this case, detectives got lucky. They uncovered physical evidence.
At this crime scene, we were able to find some fibers that were on the body of the victim over in this area. In this area here, there was some tire tracks in this rain gutter. You could actually see how a vehicle had pulled up off the roadway here and then driven forward to the north here and left the area.
The medical examiner's report confirmed that, like the first victim, Wendy Evans was strangled, and she wasn't killed where her body was found. But unlike the previous case, Wendy Evans hadn't been tied up. Investigators learned that both women worked and lived in the same neighborhood. but that didn't mean that they were killed by the same man.
In comparing LaDonna Steller to Wendy Evans' death, they did have two similarities in common, which was they were both found nude and they both shared the same lifestyle. Other than that, we had no evidence that would connect the two murders whatsoever.
As investigators searched for answers, they enlisted the expertise of criminal profilers. Since there wasn't much physical evidence, they were hoping that the profilers could uncover a behavioral pattern. Special Agent Dale Hinman joined the team. She quickly assessed both crime scenes.
What struck me was how similar the victims and the crimes were. They were both killed in the same way, then their bodies were subsequently moved to different locations. The profiling team felt very confident that both of these crimes were committed by the same offender.
Agent Hinman and Detective Klein headed to the sites where the bodies were found. They wanted to see the scene through the eyes of the perpetrator. One fact intrigued Agent Hinman. The victims were last seen in the same section of Clearwater, but their bodies had been left miles apart, in completely different surroundings. Perhaps this was the key to unlocking the identity of the predator.
Wendy Evans was last seen in the North Fort Harrison area of Clearwater. She was actually seen there the night before her body was discovered here in Oldsmar. In fact, LaDonna Steller was also last known to be alive in the North Fort Harrison Avenue area of Clearwater. Here runs this whole length.
Hinman thought the area where the women were last seen alive might offer a clue.
It's interesting that LaDonna's body is found right in the same area where she was last seen, but Wendy's body is discovered 20 miles away. I wonder what the connection is to this particular area. Maybe he lives in this area or he's connected to the area because of his job.
Hinman believed he had to know the region well enough to find places to leave his victims.
Given the distance that Wendy's body was discovered from where she started out earlier that evening and that this location is right off of a main road, this crime clearly requires the use of a vehicle.
Investigators turned their attention to the tire track found at the scene. If they could identify the type of tire that left the track, it could be their most critical piece of evidence. Tire expert Ernie Ham went to work. The fast-drying mixture he used is similar to the paste dentists use to make a tooth impression.
If we make a cast of it, we'll have a three-dimensional representation. Hopefully we can identify a brand and a make of the tire.
A tire track can be as unique as a fingerprint, and like a fingerprint, it can be smudged. Ham hoped that the cast would preserve enough of the detail to identify the print. But with the weather in Florida and the type of soil, there was no guarantee.
Sometimes you never can tell. The soil may not be holding the details as well as we think.
Back at the lab, Ham found more than just good detail. The cast held the answer they'd been looking for.
I was able to locate a Firestone ATX radial tire that has the same design features that appear in this track. So this track was made by a Firestone ATX radial tire.
Fortunately, the tire is not that common, but the identification was only useful if they could find the actual tire that made the print. Police launched their search at local Firestone dealers to find customers who might have purchased these uncommon radials. But as they chased down this new lead, a third victim, 35-year-old Peggy Anita Darnell, was found strangled and naked in a field below some electricity pylons.
We didn't find Peggy Darnell until approximately 3 weeks after her death, so there was a lot of decomposition, so we weren't able to obtain any physical evidence that would help us.
Then, 2 months later, another grim discovery. The naked body of a fourth victim, 27-year-old Cynthia Tate Pugh, was discovered lying near a rubbish container. But this time, the crime scene yielded some clues.
At Cindy Pugh's crime scene, we found some fibers that were on her body. We found some animal hair on her body.
Fibers were also found on one of the previous victims, but would they match? While the evidence was rushed to the lab, Detective Klein and Special Agent Dale Hinman headed to the spot where the most recent body was found.
These two latest scenes are quite a distance geographically from the first two scenes. What are the similarities between these two cases and the first two?
In Cindy Pugh's case and Peggy Darnell's case, both the victims were found completely nude and stripped of all their personal belongings. Both Cindy Pugh and Peggy Darnell were last seen in the North Fort Harrison area of Clearwater.
The investigators were more certain than ever that one man was behind all 4 deaths.
Even though these scenes are all far apart, the fact that the victims all started out in the same area and there are so many similarities between the scenes, this is probably the same offender.
Hinman and the team were equally sure that the way he disposed of his victims was significant.
Because of the way these victims are left on the side of the road next to a dumpster, it appears he has no regard for these women whatsoever. He may have a prior history of violence against women.
Investigators focused their search on men with a history of violence towards women, and women who had been abused or threatened. After chasing down scores of possible leads, they finally got a call that took them to the same neighborhood where all the victims were picked up. A man named Jimmy Lee Steele had threatened a local woman and her daughter.
He made statements to the effect that he could put this woman in a dumpster like he's done to other women in the past.
The police noted that Steele's job as a construction worker sent him all over Clearwater and Pinellas County. Then detectives learned something that threw the investigation of Steele into high gear.
When we investigated Mr. Steele, we found out that he had a connection to one of the victims, Cindy Pugh. We learned that at one time, Cindy Pugh was seen in his company.
Could Jimmy Lee Steele be the Pinellas County serial killer? In Pinellas County, Florida, 4 women had been murdered. A construction worker named Jimmy Lee Steele fitted the profile.
We all thought Jimmy Steele was a good suspect in this case. He lived in the same area. He had threatened a woman that lived in that neighborhood. He'd been seen with the 4th victim. The detectives decided to take a closer look at him.
Investigators went to his home to look for hair or fibers that might incriminate him.
We looked at the different carpets that were in his house to see if any of the evidence in his house could possibly match the evidence found on the victims.
Fibers from Steele's house were sent to the lab and processed, but the results weren't what police expected.
None of the items collected from his house matched any of the evidence we found at the crime scenes.
Investigators concluded that Jimmy Lee Steele was not the man they were looking for. But the setback was only temporary. Detectives combing through lists of tire owners found the needle in the haystack. A receipt for the one set of Firestone Radial ATX tires sold in Pinellas County. The buyer, a local woman named Terry Jo Howard.
Terry Jo Howard didn't seem like a good suspect to the detectives, but then they found out that she lived with a man named James Randall. Now they just needed to find out how he was connected to the tires.
Investigators devised a plan to gain possession of the tires from Randall's truck.
We bought 4 tires here at the sheriff's office, and we had the tire dealership in on the scheme with us.
The owner offered Randall a free set of tires. Randall took him up on the deal.
We then had all 4 of the Firestone Radial ATX tires that were on James Randall's truck.
Police shipped the tires to the expert and discovered they were a match to the print left at the crime scene of Wendy Evans's murder. But while Randall's tires were at the crime scene, it didn't prove that he had killed her.
James Randall moved higher up the list of suspects when the detectives learned that he had a prior history for violence against women. They also discovered that he was a window installer, so he would have been more familiar with the remote areas of the county.
Police put Randall's and Terry Jo's apartment under surveillance. For several months, they observed the couple's daily routine. Randall exhibited no unusual behavior.
There were no domestic disputes. There was no reason for the police to have any contact with him.
After months of work, investigators began to wonder if they were watching the wrong man. Agent Hinman arrived to offer the profiler's perspective.
From our surveillance, we were able to see that James Randall was living a normal life. He was spending time with his girlfriend, shopping at the mall, holding hands. He was working on a daily basis. So we didn't see anything out of the ordinary.
To Agent Hinman, his behavior fitted the profile.
That's what we would expect from an individual like him, because he doesn't feel badly about these crimes. If he knew them well or had a prior relationship, perhaps he would react differently.
Investigators were reassured that Randall was a good suspect. They just needed the evidence to prove it. And fibers found on 2 of the bodies could be the lead they were looking for. They came from a pink carpet.
Well, and pink carpet fibers are more likely to be found in a residence than in a vehicle.
Was Randall committing these crimes in his own home? Animal hair found on the 4th victim was analyzed. Now they wondered if it might provide the answer they sought.
They came back and told us that the hair is actually from a dog, and they told us the breed was a pug.
Isn't this a pug in Terry Jo Howard's arms at the residence?
Yes, that's a surveillance photo of...
So it's possible that the attacks actually occurred in the offender's apartment?
Yes.
Without probable cause to obtain a search warrant, investigators needed a way to collect the evidence that would put him away.
The plan was that we would send 2 undercover detectives into James Randall's residence while he was not at home and offer Terry Jo Howard a free dog wash for her dog. We were hoping that during the dog wash they would be able to pull off some of the dog hairs.
The ruse worked.
Terry Jo Howard was very willing to let the undercover detectives wash the dog. At the point when they were drying the dog off, they were able to, in fact, pull numerous dog hairs off the dog.
The dog hair was sent to the lab for comparison. It was a match. A warrant was issued for James Randall's arrest. But when police tried to arrest him, Randall made a run for it in his pickup truck. In an act of desperation, he took off into dense traffic.
Fortunately, he made it across the highway without hitting anybody. We chased him through that neighborhood. The vehicle was eventually lost behind a house. On that particular day, we were not able to find him.
Police scoured Randall's neighborhood.
We had our canine people out there looking. We had the helicopters up looking for him. We had people looking for James Randall 24 hours a day during this time.
4 days later, tired and hungry from living in the woods, Randall gave himself up.
Since the evidence was mostly circumstantial, the detectives wanted a confession to strengthen their case. But in spite of their best efforts, Randall wouldn't admit to anything. But they did find out what triggered the crimes when his girlfriend visited him in jail.
James Randall confessed to her that he hurt these other women so that he would not hurt her. She chose to share that information with the prosecutor, and it was eventually used against him at his trial.
Randall was found guilty of the murders of Wendy Evans and Cynthia Tate Pugh and sentenced to life in prison. As for the other 2 victims, LaDonna Stella and Peggy Darnell, where no hairs, fibers, or other evidence were ever found, Randall appears to have got away with their murders.
James Randall may have thought that by getting rid of his victims and all of the evidence that could link him to his crimes, that he was outsmarting the investigative team. But patience and good police work uncovered the clues that were needed to put him away for life.